a lot of people, they get the message down and they don't get the audio down. You're saying things to be heard, so make sure that you're heard. Make sure every part of you is heard. We wouldn't be making these podcasts if we didn't think we had something important to say. Say it. Say it loud. Say it proud. Say it consistently loud. It's important. Compression is super important. What is going on, everybody? My name is Tom Kelly. I'm the founder of Clean Cut Audio, a podcast production, coaching, and consulting company based in Denver, Colorado. Thank you so much for buying Podcaster's Kit, and thank you especially for finding your way to my course on compression. I guarantee that compression is one of the most important elements of a podcast mixing, production, processing process. And at the same time, it is the least understood of all. So let's very quickly go over what is compression. Well, it sounds exactly what it sounds like. It is crushing something together. Now, in terms of a podcast, what it's crushing is the dynamic range, which is the difference between the loudest and the quietest part of your podcast. It is bringing down the loudest parts, and then later on, we're going to bring up everything together so that your podcast is equally loud without moments of getting really loud and then getting really quiet. So think about any time you've been listening to a podcast, maybe in your car, in an environment that's not very quiet. There's a lot of background noise. And everyone starts laughing and the podcast is so loud and you have to grab the volume knob and turn it down. But then 5 seconds later, they get quiet again and you can't hear anything, so you have to turn it back up. And then maybe a minute later, it gets real loud and then it's quiet, it's loud, it's quiet. Or think of any time you've watched cable television and the commercials get really loud. How annoying is that? Don't you always say to yourself, why can't they just be the same volume of the show itself? Well, there's other reasons for that, but what you wish they had was a compressor. So I have this really real simple graphic that I made, not the graphic designer, I'm the audio guy, but it will kind of abstractly show you what we're dealing with in compression. And then we can really dive into it. We can listen to a lot of examples, going to show a lot of visuals so that by the time you're done with this course, you're going to know how a compressor works, what it's actually doing, and how to set one up properly so that your show doesn't have those issues of people grabbing at the volume knob, because that is the fastest way to lose listeners if you make them work to enjoy your show. We don't want that. So after this course, you're going to know how to fix that problem in just a matter of minutes. And then hopefully, like me and everyone else, you'll spend the next 10 years of your life trying to perfect how to use a compressor, because it's easy to learn. The principles are simple, but there's a lot to it. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to experience. And to me, that's the exciting part of audio. Audio is my art. I'm a podcaster as well, but you'll see how complex and simple at the same time this thing is. But let's take a look at this graphic. What we have here is a couple of audio bars, right? We have some really loud, we've got some medium, and we've got some quiet. So what we're going to do is we're going to set what is called a threshold and say we don't want anything to get louder than or above this black line. So this is our threshold right here. We want everything to be cut at this black line. So what it's going to do, it's going to cut everything. So now this looks more like an even signal here, but if we compare it to the beginning, it looks very quiet now. So the next step is we're going to use what's called makeup gain. And now everything is louder. It's not perfect. A compressor can't make things perfect in one go. Sometimes it takes multiple tries. We're not going to really get into that right now, but we can see that the average loudness it's all going to be louder on average because everything is louder together. So from this here, we have less dynamic range, less up and down, and we also have a louder average across the entire board. So this is going to be much more palatable in a podcast, having something that is loud consistently than this that's going to be up and down, up and down, up and down. So you can hear it in my voice now. I have more than one compressor running, even though I'm not a very dynamic speaker. But what you'll find is that my whisper and me talking very quietly into the microphone, and then me yelling into the microphone, a compressor is going to bring it all about to this middle range here. And it did all that work on its own. I didn't have to go in there and fiddle with all these settings and raise and lower things manually. A compressor brought everything down to this middle state, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So again, what is a compressor? It is an audio signal processing tool that lowers the highest points of your audio based on whatever threshold you set, and then consequently you will raise everything together to give you an even loud signal, short-term and long-term, across your whole podcast. Again, we don't want people reaching for that volume knob. That's bad. That's a very bad listener experience. We're going to mitigate that today. So I'm in Pro Tools here. You don't need to use Pro Tools. You can use whichever DAW or audio recording editing software you use. A compressor comes free with every software. And the good thing about this is compression is so important that it would not be uncommon to walk into a music recording studio and see $50,000 to $100,000 worth of hardware, rack-mounted compressor units in a recording studio. This is such an important tool that people will spend years of salary on these tools because what this does to your track is so important. Now, those hardware compressors are also coloring sound in a way that an analog unit would. But again, one voice would be a $3,000 unit just to compress it in each pass. So if you have 3 people in your podcast, you'd be spending close to $10,000 to compress your voice. Well, lucky us as podcasters, we don't need all that coloring of warm analog gear. We have a free plugin in every DAW. So I want to take a second to recognize us, the humble podcaster who has everything they want for free. So let's take a look at this compressor. The reason why I like this compressor so much is because it has this graph right here, and it's really helpful for teaching new people what these parameters are doing. Because audio, it gets a little hard to hear, especially subtle differences sometimes if you don't have those golden ears from decades of ear training and listen to very, very subtle nuances in audio. It's helpful to see it because, we've been critically looking at stuff our whole lives, whether we really know it or not, but we're not always critically listening to everything. So, on this graph right here, if we take a look, we can see that line moving up and down clear as day. Now, whether or not you can hear what that line is doing or representing, it's a different story, but having the visual to put to the audible cues is going to be very, very helpful. So that's why I'm using the stock compressor that comes with Avid Pro Tools, even though it's not really my compressor of choice, but it'll be really helpful for this demonstration. So let's bring this back to default settings, and we're going to turn it off, and we're going to listen to these sine waves. Now, a sine wave is a pure tone of one frequency, and think of the censored beep when someone swears. That is a 1 kilohertz sine wave, and that's what we are going to be listening to right now. We can see from the waveform, which there's more to it than this, but it represents loudness. We'll say that for right now. It's actually voltage and this and that, but we're not going to worry about it. It's loudness. We can see that this is going to be louder than that. And the point of a compressor is for all of this to end somewhere in the middle pretty consistently. But let's just take a listen. Have your hands at the ready in case this is a little louder than you expect it to be. I'll try to not blow out your ears, but the whole point of this is to learn how to not do that. So we're going to mitigate that over time. Let's take a listen. Okay, so that's a big difference in loudness. Let's take a look at this plugin, this compressor here. The first thing we're going to look at is the threshold, which is right here. It's also right here. And it's represented by this orange line. Now, this graph is going to be showing loudness in versus loudness out. We'll get to that with the ratio as well. But for right now, if we're trying to bring this loud portion closer to this one, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to this portion and we're going to set the threshold to about where that is on this meter here. So let's take a listen. All right, so you can see that that green line is right at the arrow here. And this dot that's going down represents the audio, and it's coming up right to that threshold. That's exactly what we want. So we have our threshold set, and with the stock settings of 3:1, we'll get there. If you don't know what that is right now, that's fine. We'll get there. Let's just notice what's happening on the graph. Let's look for anything that changes. All right, we have a couple things. You can see that the in signal is higher than the out signal for this first portion here, and then it levels off right here. So let's take a look at that again. I'm going to be looking right here. And then we also have this red line here, which is the gain reduction line. That's showing how much work it's doing of trying to pull down what's going through the threshold. This is how much it's chopping off the top here. And then we also have this line here, which to show the difference between what's happening, let's look at a 1-to-1 ratio, which is nothing happening. We're going to look at ratios a little bit now. All right, so it's much louder, and you can see that dot is going all the way up this line in a 1-to-1 ratio, which is an even slope, 45-degree angles up. But if we change this back to where it was with the 3-to-1, you can see that that dot is riding on this line. It's going where this line is telling it to go. So rather than being up here, it's now much further down. The signal is being compressed to not be as loud as it once was. Now, this is a good time to talk about the ratio. What the ratio is loudness in to loudness out. And the ratio, what it's portraying is for every 3 decibels that goes past our set threshold, it only allows the output to be raised by 1 decibel. So 3 gets chopped down to 1. And I'm going to change the ratio to a much higher ratio. And you can see this line here becomes less steep. And what that's showing is for every 10 decibels that goes beyond the threshold, it's being brought down to just 1 decibel. So this is going to be doing a lot of work. So to review, we set the threshold based on the lower signal. And I know this is a little abstract because we're not talking about human voices yet. I promise you we will get there. We're just starting on the sine wave because it's much easier to see what's happening when less is happening. So let's take this ratio to 3:1, which is the stock setting. We have our threshold set to where we want it, which is based on the lower signal in order to bring the louder part down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to record the output of this track down here, because what we're seeing right here is the raw signal. We want to see what it looks like after it's compressed. So I'm going to do that right now. All right, there's a lot of things going on, but what we're going to focus on is how much smaller this portion of the track is. Now, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I always go the wrong way the first time. And I'm going to slide this track up, and we can see the darker track here is after, and the lighter track is before. So there's a couple things to notice. Obviously, this is much smaller. But again, if we bring it back up, the interesting part is this quieter portion is just about the same on both tracks. And that's because we set our threshold to be up slightly above the quieter part, so it's not affecting the quiet stuff. It's only affecting the loud stuff to bring it closer to the quieter stuff. That is compression. It is reducing the dynamic range, which is the difference in loudness between the louder part and the quieter part. So this is a 3:1 ratio with a pretty heavy threshold set. If we were to raise that threshold a bit, it would allow more to come through. So this initial portion would be louder, but we're trying to get it close to the softer part. So that is with a low threshold. Let's see what that 10:1 does. And we're going to record that again. All right, so we can, again, I did it the wrong way. We can see that this did even more work in bringing the higher signal closer to the lower one. I'm going to compare this to 3:1, so there's a significant amount there, but you might notice it's not 3 times smaller, just something to keep in mind, even though 3 is a little more than a third of 10. But let's take a look at it compared to the original, and that is very, very, very significant how much was taken off there. So it's much closer to the original track. So maybe less of a difference between 3:1 and 10:1 than we anticipated. But you know what? Let's make another track here. I'm going to call this Extreme. And I'm going to record a 100:1 and see what that looks like. Okay. Interesting. Again, you can see it did a little bit more work than 10:1, but 100:1 didn't do much more work than 10:1, which is really fascinating. Again, all of these components play together. We probably wanted to set that threshold down a bit more in order for it to do more work, because your brain would think 100:1 would do way more than 10:1, but it really doesn't. So again, the understanding kind of what a ratio does might be a little simple, but hearing it in practice and seeing what it does is a little more complex. All right, so 3:1, 10:1, 100:1. Either way, anything is better than raw. So if you have gotten this far without putting a compressor on your track, we can see the difference. It is shocking what this difference is. So let's review really quickly. We set our threshold based on what we want to knock down. We're determining what is too loud, and we want to bring stuff down. The ratio determines how much it's going to bring that down. It will let things pass across that threshold, but a higher ratio means less is going to go across. Again, for every 10 decibels, which 10 decibels might seem, again, more abstract, but adding 10 decibels to something is twice as loud. So for every 10 decibels that crosses the threshold, it will only allow one to come out. So again, the ratio is input versus output. Now, for podcasts, for voiceover, it's usually recommended to be somewhere between a 4 and 5 ratio. Because as you get past 10 and especially to 100, little bonus thing, that is called limiting. You may have noticed this plugin is called Compressor/limiter. The only difference between the two is really the ratio. A limiter is much, much, much more aggressive. And if something crazy loud were to come through, it's going to say, this is a brick wall. You are not getting past this threshold. I'm stopping it right now. We're not really looking for a limiter. We want a compressor because we'll hear later on how this affects our voice when the threshold is set improperly, when the ratio is set improperly. But we're looking for something a little less extreme, between 3 and 5, maybe 6. But again, it depends on where you set your threshold, because these two especially need each other to be on point, because if your threshold is really crushing that signal, a lower ratio might be more acceptable. But if you have your threshold setting a little higher so it's not chopping off as much, a much more extreme ratio might be acceptable because it's not cutting off the lower stuff. That might be more understandable as we move on in this course. But for right now, it's just important to know that, again, this is abstract. We're working with sine waves, but the two are crucially important. Now, something to recognize with all of these tracks as we move on to the attack portion is we can see that this track was loud for a little bit before it got quieter. What's the deal with that? Why isn't it just working out of the gate? Well, that's the attack time. And what the attack time does, it says, I'm going to wait 10 milliseconds after audio passes the threshold to turn the compressor on. And we can see that here. This is about 10 milliseconds. If we look up here, it's 10 milliseconds. That's about how long it takes to turn on. This is considered a pretty short attack time. But let's take a look at what happens when we increase that attack time. And then we'll have a conversation about what all of this means and what is recommended for podcasts. Because again, this is voiceover work we're talking about. This is Podcaster's Kit. So we want to make sure that we're keeping everything in the frame of podcasting. So we're going to keep our ratio, let's say 6-1, since we're calling that fair for podcasting. Our threshold is set to where it was before. And let's record this track at the 10 millisecond attack time, and it should look pretty similar to this track over here. All right, so we have our baseline. This is 10 milliseconds. Right there. Now, I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to up this to, let's say, 50 milliseconds. So if you were to guess what this track would look like, what would your guess be? Would it kind of look like this, but stretched out to 5 times the length? Let's take a look. Let's record it. All right, so what do we got here? All right, so if you guessed that it was going to be 5 times longer, you're right. It's about 5 times longer. But did you notice that the entire track itself is louder than the one above it? We didn't change the ratio. We didn't change the threshold. So what's going on here? We can see before is the darker part, and then after is the lighter one above it. So the attack might do more than we think it does. What's going to happen if we change it to 100 milliseconds? All right, so again, our little slope here is about twice as long as the one above it. Whoop, sorry about that. But again, the entire signal itself is slightly louder. Now, this is the easy part. I'm going to tell you to just keep the attack short. 10 milliseconds is probably good. And here's the reason why this one is pretty easy to just call it a standard. Normally in audio, there are not standards as we think of them. You can't just say set your threshold to this because, well, it depends on how loud your audio is. You can't really give a recommendation without hearing and seeing the track for yourself. But the attack time is one that you can just kind of say, keep it at 10 milliseconds. Because think about what you really want to compress in a podcast. It's going to be pretty quick, very loud things. Think of a laugh. It happens really quickly and then it's over really quickly. So if we have a long attack time and say the compressor waits 100 milliseconds to turn on, each individual chuckle or whatever you want to call it, the ha ha ha, each individual ha is less than 100 milliseconds. So if our compressor isn't turning on until 100 milliseconds later, it's missing the whole laugh. So we don't want a long attack time. A long attack time is good for maybe some music, right? A snare drum that we want that initial crack to come out, and then we want to compress the rest of that reverb tail to really bring up the body of the rest of it. But we're not recording drums right now. We're recording a voice. And while each voice is different, they all kind of act the same on those really loud parts. So 10 milliseconds, that's usually about what most plugins just come with, standard 10 milliseconds. Just leave it. It should be good. It would be fun to experiment, and we will later on with the voices. But for right now, we're not going to see like a huge change with the sine wave, but we will definitely, when we get into the voices, we'll see this being a much bigger issue. So hang tight when we get to actual speech. But right now, we just want to visualize everything as easily as possible. So the next thing we're going to look at is the release time. And again, this is a time-based process. And what it's saying is after the audio dips back below the threshold, how long am I going to wait until the compressor is fully disengaged? And right now it's set to 80 milliseconds. That is the default for this plugin. Let's zoom in here and we can see that. So again, if the compressor is bringing the signal down, we can see that it's doing its job here. It's bringing that signal down. But then when it suddenly changes to a quieter tone, it's still bringing that signal down for 80 milliseconds. So this length here, it is taking that much time for the compressor to turn off and disengage. So if we bring this track up, you can see the difference here. The compressor is still on and it's crushing the signal and it comes back up again. And this is going to be an interesting one to hear because a bad release time causes this effect called pumping. And it's when a compressor is quickly engaging and then it's slowly disengaging and you can hear the audio. It sounds like, oh man, this is a hard visual. If someone's voice were like the shape of a balloon and while they're talking, they're just kind of compressing it and then slowly letting it go and it's getting crushed and then it's bringing back to life and then it's getting crushed. It's bad. You don't want to hear that because again, the whole point is for a consistent loudness across the board. We don't want pumping. We'll hear a lot of that right now with the sine wave and then we'll hear it with speech later. So again, we have the 10 millisecond attack time. We have our 80 millisecond release time. So in theory, what I record should be the same as this track right here. Let's check it out. All right, so that's our baseline. I'm going to increase the release time to, let's double it. Let's say 160 milliseconds. Let's record that track. Take a listen. All right, there's a little bit there. Let's go extreme because, again, you hear things best in extremes when you're starting out. Let's say 750 milliseconds. I'm sure you heard the pumping that time. Let's listen to that again because it's some pretty extreme stuff here. So we quickly hear it go really quiet and then come back out, and that was pumping. And if we zoom in, we can see the difference between these tracks. This was 80 milliseconds. This was 160 milliseconds, and this was 750 milliseconds. And let's just kind of shuffle through listening to these real quick. So this is going to be the raw track with no compressor. And this is a short release time. A little bit of a pop there. A little bit longer release time. A little bit more of like a duck, like a little wave. There's some pumping there. And then again, long release time. And again, this is the kind of thing where, gosh, usually the stock release time just kind of works. And this is actually a pretty good tip for DAWs or audio software in general. If you, on a Mac, option click, I don't know what it is on PC, Alt maybe. If you option click a button, it will go back to what is called Unity or the default setting. We'll see that with the ratio as well. Boom, 3-1. But we don't want that. We're going to keep it 6-1. But that's a really good way of quickly getting back to your default. If you raise the volume 12 decibels, alt click back to 0, change the pan, alt click back to Unity. Good tip. That's a bonus one. I'll give you that one for free. All right. So what have we gone through here? We've gone through our threshold is always the first thing that you set because you want to know what you want to make softer. And then the ratio is usually next, how aggressively you want to make that softer, if that sounds kind of funny, like an oxymoron there. And then the attack and release, you can kind of leave, but we'll experiment with that later on. We're not going to pay attention to this side chain. That's a story for a different day, but the knee is an interesting one. Now, you can probably leave this at 0, but let's go through it since you've already paid, you're already here. Let's do it. Now, the knee is often confused with the attack time. But what this does is rather than the audio traveling up this little loudness graph, and then after a certain amount of milliseconds after it crosses, it gets compressed, what the knee does is it kind of rounds off that ratio. So again, we'll look at things in extremes. You can see it rounding off there. So rather than a knee of 0 decibels, turning the knee up will actually change the amount of compression before it hits the threshold, and then it rolls it off after it hits the threshold so that it kind of eases into full compression rather than just hitting it all at once. Now, this is, again, probably something that's more a little catered towards music production because just across the board, music production is more difficult. Can we say that? More difficult than podcast production? Sure, you're talking 200 tracks of 50 different voices or instruments compared to 2 tracks of the same voice or instrument, whatever. It's much simpler. So we don't really need that knee. We don't need the intricacies of it. But if you have it, it's fun to experiment with it. Just play with it. And you can see that it will, it just starts compressing a little bit sooner. It'll roll into it. But since podcasting is about being kind of natural and transparent, just don't worry about it. But play with this until your heart's content. This stuff is really, really fascinating. All of these components are really unique and interesting. So let's just go through everything again. I want you to come away from this video just knowing everything. A compressor reduces dynamic range, which is the difference between the loudest and the softest audio signal. You set the threshold to determine anything beyond this is considered too loud. And then your ratio will say, this is how much I want that signal to come down after it passes the threshold. In podcasting, 3 to 6 is okay. If you set your threshold appropriately, 10 might be okay as well. Depends on what you're looking for. Now, I don't want to confuse you too much, but in the voice that you're hearing right now, there's actually 2 compressors working on it. Actually, probably 3. I don't know if we're going to get into multi-band compression today. Maybe if we have time. Maybe if you really want me to, I'll do it. But I have 2 compressors running. One is a 4-to-1 ratio, and that threshold is pretty low. It's compressing a lot, but the ratio isn't very high. So it's getting things kind of more into the middle. And then I have a second compressor with a much higher threshold with a much higher ratio. And what that's doing is if it gets like real loud, or if for some reason I were to be like a crazy person in my studio alone laughing, only that second compressor, or I guess I should say the second compressor, is really only hitting that stuff that gets egregiously loud. So you have one compressor that does most of the work, hitting with a low threshold, meaning it's catching more. It's saying a lot of stuff is too loud, but then a pretty low ratio, meaning it's not compressing it too much. It's bringing it all up. It's getting a lot of body, a lot of warmth. And then I have a second compressor that's much selective about what's too loud, but what's too loud is way too loud, mister. And we got to really bring that down. So we'll get into that later, kind of grouping compressors, doing 2 different things. But the stage where we are right now, I'm going to just listen to some of these tracks and again, get really familiar with what these meters are doing. Again, I don't know of another compressor that has this graph. So maybe let's look at, these are all the compressors that I have. I've got a lot of them. They're all for different things. The one that I use in podcasting the most is the API 2500 compressor from Waves. It models an outboard gear. Again, if I were to buy this compressor, they're thousands of dollars. I bought this for $30 off of Waves, and it's modeled after the analog compressors. So the effects of it are very similar if you turn the analog function on. But for podcasting, I'm going to keep that off because we don't want to introduce more noise than we need. So this looks drastically different from this compressor, right? Let's notice the differences. Well, let's notice the similarities first. We have our threshold, right? Attack. We've got our ratio. The release. Where is it? There we go. And a variable release. Don't even worry about that. Don't worry about it. We have got a knee down here. And there's some other things that are unique to this compressor, but it has all the main components we talked about. The difference is this meter here. It looks a little different, but it does the same thing. Now, this is measuring the gain reduction, which is GR. You can change that, but what the gain reduction is, it's how much of that signal it's chopping off. And that's, again, dependent on the threshold and the ratio. Over here, our gain reduction is on this side. So I don't want to affect this signal twice, but we'll take a listen to the main track. We'll see the gain reduction over here. So that's cutting off about 6 decibels. And if you allow me very quickly to set this in the same way, 19.6, we have our attack. And I actually just discovered something very important. These 2 thresholds measure different versions of a decibel. There are many different types of a decibel, and we are not going to get into it. But the important thing is, in order to get 6 decibels of gain reduction on the Dyne 3 compressor, we have our threshold set to negative 19.6 decibels. Now, for you, knowing exactly what that's measuring isn't really important as long as you know that we want the line to basically be just above that signal. Now, this API measures a different kind of decibel, so its threshold is set at 6.52 decibels in order to get the same amount of gain reduction. So, if you were to ask me, what should my threshold be set to? And I'm looking at my API compressor saying 7.5 decibels. That's not a number that's available on this other compressor. So asking someone for advice on an audio track that they don't have in front of them, if they have a different plugin, it's not useful because all of these plugins act a little bit differently. It's not important for you to know the difference between the decibels right now. Just know that some of this stuff doesn't translate. So it's important for you to know how to set your threshold on any compressor based on the inputs and the gain reduction here. I hope I didn't lose you on that one. Basically just saying you've got to learn these things for yourself. And that's what you're doing here right now. So I really appreciate you being with me. So we looked at the ratio, attack time, and release time. I think we're ready to dive into some voices since we've seen the difference on these sine waves. Okay, welcome to the voice spoken word portion of this compressor training. I chose a very short 7-second clip from, this is my voice. This is from my podcast, Reminiscent. We talk about early 2000s music, mainly pop punk, always emo music. If you're into those bands, it's kind of a fun podcast. I'm not the most dynamic speaker, but we can see here's a laugh. And here's a portion that's slightly quieter than this one. And we're going to try to bring this all together so that the laughs aren't too loud. So let's just take a listen to the raw track with nothing on it. I have it just turned up a little bit just to make sure it's loud enough. And we're going to listen to it with no compression on the track. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. I love Mike. All right, so the laugh is a little loud, and then that Live in Texas portion gets pretty quiet. And if anyone out there loves Linkin Park as much as I do / did when I was 14, what's up? We'll have to talk about it. So let's turn this compressor on, and these are the settings from the sine waves, and these are not going to be relevant settings to what is in this spoken word track because the audio source changed. So we need to kind of recalibrate, regroup, and figure out our threshold. So I know that I definitely want to knock off this laugh. I probably want to bring everything about to this signal. So I'm going to loop this and set my threshold to right above this portion. The brand DC, the brand DC, the brand DC, the brand DC. Okay, so no compression here. Let's take a look at if anything is going above this as we listen to the whole track. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. Okay, so that's a pretty good threshold. It's going to not touch this, and it's going to bring the rest of this stuff down. We have the 6-to-1 ratio. Let's dial in a 3-to-1, and let's listen to that compared to a 6-to-1. Let's record it so we can also take a look. I love Mike Shinoda. Ooh, that's fun. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, again, we are going to listen to this track after it's compressed, and then we're going to compare it visually and audibly against the uncompressed track. There's a little bit of weird routing we have to do here to not get echo, so bear with me as I get through that. But first we'll compare waveform. So this waveform is uncompressed, nothing done to it, and we're going to record to the track below. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right, so let's compare these two side by side. Again, since we set the threshold to this portion should remain mainly untouched, and we can already see that these laughs, these louder portions, were brought down. So let me scoot this track up, and we can see here the threshold was set. We can imagine it about right here. So that part was untouched. This part that went above the threshold was brought down, and then these laughs were brought down significantly. So that was the 3-to-1 ratio. Let's make this a little more extreme, and we're going to set our ratio to 10-to-1. Same threshold. And we're going to record this. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right, let's take a look. I'm going to compare these two. So the 3-to-1 and the 10-to-1 ratio, this is interesting, doesn't look very different, does it? It looks about the same as a 3-to-1. So what is the problem there? The threshold wasn't low enough for it to really capture anything. So that's an important lesson. Let's turn our threshold down. I'm going to duplicate this track here. So again, 3-to-1, 10-to-1. Now we are going to go back up to 3-to-1, lower the threshold, and now let's listen to the difference here. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. So we probably heard a much bigger difference that time. And we can see it when we compare the tracks. It was affecting much more of the track with a much lower threshold. And you can probably hear that the voice was a little bit squished compared to this other side here. So let's take a look at same ratio 3-to-1 with a stronger threshold on the second one. So let's take a listen to the first one. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC and more intense threshold. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4. So it might be hard to tell out of the gate, but this is actually over compressed. That signal is squished. I don't like it personally. So I'm going to raise this threshold again, kind of split the difference, and I'm going to re-record that and see what we get. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right. Now that sounded better. And let's compare the two. So it is not affecting much of this earlier signal here. It's chopping off the laughs. And then we'll compare the much more extreme threshold to this one. We can see that especially right here, it's crushing that. And it made my voice sound like it is trapped in a room that's too small for it, and its fat little voice body is just spilling out of the crevices. That's over compressed. We don't want that. That's no good. I'm going to play the two side by side to take a listen to pretty well compressed to over compressed. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore. Hopefully you can hear that. It's crushed on the second one. We'll listen one more time. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore. And if you can't hear it, let's go extreme, baby. Let's compress this to death. We're only playing with the threshold here, not the ratio. And again, an important lesson, that ratio is 3-to-1, which I said previously is a healthy range. So if you're just focusing in on that 3-to-1 ratio, it's easy to say, oh, that looks like a good setting, but there is one other parameter that's off, and that's what's affecting this signal so much. So let us record this heavily compressed signal here, and let's see what it does. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right, so if we zoom in, we can see the audio signal looks very, very low, but it also looks very even. So I said before we want the signal even. We just found out that too even might not be good. So we don't want to do this all at once. Now might be a good time, though, to go over gain. So I mentioned that a compressor will take down the loudest parts of the track and then subsequently bring everything up together so that it's all evenly loud. You may have been wondering this whole time, when does it get louder? It's only getting quieter. Well, that's what the makeup gain is for. So I'm going to set this back to a normal threshold. I'm gonna have to listen again. Like Shinoda, he's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years. All right, 19.2. I like that. So we're going to record that down to this track here. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. Okay, so we can see by comparison, this is all kind of quieter. So the makeup gain, we're going to now raise the volume of everything. So let's say 3 decibels. And I'm going to record that down here. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right, so a couple things to look at here. This is now all consistently louder than the track above it that didn't have makeup gain. But let's slide it up to the original track. And what we're going to find, this is what's really fascinating. All of the parts right here are louder, but we notice that the laugh is still quieter than the original track. And these parts here are quieter than the original track. So what this did was it raised the lower parts and it lowered the high parts. And that, my friends, is compression. So while this track had parts that got much louder than we wanted them, the average of the entire track is actually quieter than the compressed track. Let's do this more extreme again, so it's easier to see, it's easier to hear. I am going to, let's crush it to death like we did before. And record down below. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right. So let's record onto the bottom track and we're going to crush it like we did before. And we're going to see that this track gets real quiet. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right. So we see that it's much quieter than all of these other tracks. That's no good. And again, this isn't a good sounding track, but it's just for the demonstration purposes. So this is too quiet. It compressed too much. So the makeup gain, let's give it 8 decibels. That's a lot. So we're going to record over this. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the Live in Texas. All right. So you saw that it passed over and made the signal much louder. It's still quieter than the rest. So let's take it up 15.6 decibels. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusively for like 4 years because of the live in Texas. All right, so this is overcompressed again, but it's important to hear these examples because I'll say it again, you hear things better starting out in extreme versions. So we can see that this is very level and it's very equally loud. Let's take it up to the original track. Let me zoom in a bit here. We can see that everything is much louder except for the laughs. The laughs are the same volume, which is interesting. So that is setting different thresholds on the human voice. Now for the attack portion of this video. Again, I mentioned before, we pretty much want the attack to be quick in podcasting. I could just say set it to 10 milliseconds and don't worry about it, but I want you all to be able to visualize what this means for your podcast. So as I mentioned, the laughs are what's going to be important. So I have a very, very short attack time. Instantaneously, this compressor is engaging when the volume, the loudness crosses the threshold. So I'm going to record this into, we'll start at the top track and we'll work our way down. So this is an extremely fast attack time. This is the threshold that we had before. Let's get it back to 19.2. And we're going to look at the way it affects these laughs here because they are happening in very short milliseconds. So let's record this. We're here because of the live in Texas. All right, I'm going to get through all of these and then we'll analyze them. Let's take this up to 240. We're here because of the live in Texas. And 10 milliseconds where it started. We're here because of the live in Texas. Okay, so we're going to see that again, the attack played a huge role on the sound of this audio. Let's take a look at 10 milliseconds versus raw. And we can actually see it's pretty cool. You can see the compressor turning on in the curve of this. So over 10 milliseconds, the compressor is engaging. And then through the release, the 80 milliseconds, it's letting off and it's engaging again. All right. And now the much shorter time, we can see almost right away that attack. It's not waiting a nanosecond to turn on. It is hitting those laughs hard. It's not even letting them through. And then this is the extreme version, even compared to the one below it. Not much of a difference, but definitely in terms of milliseconds, we see how quickly that thing is turning on. It's crushing those laughs. Now, again, the point is to sound natural. We don't want those laughs crushed. We just want them controlled a bit. You know, if it's a little bit louder than the rest, that's fine because that's the way things are in real life. A laugh can be a little louder for a very short amount of time. The problem is when things are consistently too loud for a longer period of time. Now, let's take a look at the release. This is going to be a fun one because this might actually play an important role in how quickly this thing can get turned off before it's getting re-engaged by our compressor here. So we got the raw track here. Let's make this release super fast, 5 milliseconds, and record it to low. We're here because of the live in Texas. Let's see if there's any difference between different lengths of the release time. We're here because of the live in Texas. We're here because of the live in Texas. Okay. So longer release time up top. So again, the release time is the amount of time it'll take for that compressor to turn off. Now we see with the longer release time, the compressor never really turned off throughout this whole portion because it took that long after it crossed the threshold for the compressor to turn off. So that's actually hitting more of this than, say, when the compressor time was very short, because by the time we got to this portion in the audio, the compressor was already off. And then we laughed again, and it took longer for the compressor to turn on. And by the time this laugh was over, it was already off again. So there's a discrepancy between it takes really long to turn on and then it's off instantaneously. It's not really doing anything to the track. So again, I hope this just all hammers home how important it is for all of these parameters to be set appropriately. Again, the attack and release are pretty good at whatever default setting they're at. The threshold needs to be appropriate for the track itself. And then the ratio will come after that. Start with maybe a 3-to-1, 4-to-1. It's funny because I do these different settings to show you what the difference between them is. And it's interesting that in some of them, we don't see a huge difference. And again, it's because it's dependent on the threshold. It's dependent on the attack. All of this stuff needs to work together. But ultimately, what you need to rely on are your ears. That is the most important thing. Whatever a waveform looks like, let me show you something. People might say, oh man, this waveform is so loud. I might, it might hurt my ears. It might be distorted. It might be just really, really loud. People might say this one it looks kind of quiet, whereas this one looks a little bit louder. It's all the same thing. I'm just adjusting the waveform height in Pro Tools. So while visuals are a good thing to base to base audio off of, it's only when compared to something else with the same parameters. Just looking at this waveform on its own, this looks loud, this looks quiet, but it doesn't actually affect the sound. I can make it look however I want. It's only important when it's adjusted together. So if they looked drastically different, like say this, okay, this is loud compared to that, definitely, but on their own, it means nothing. So you can't always rely on your eyes, and this is a good example of that. I love Mike Shinoda. He's the reason I wore the brand DC exclusive. Right, it doesn't change with how it looks. So it all boils down to this. I recorded this short segment we're going to listen to with no effects on it. Too quiet. Too loud. Just right. Obviously, nothing about that was just right. So let's take a listen to after compression. Too quiet. Too loud. Just right. Okay, so what was different? If we put the tracks on top of each other, the quiet portion was brought up, the loud portion was brought down significantly, and then just right was also brought up, so that everything, even the whisper and even the yell, sounds the same as just right. And that is what we are going for in this compression. The way this was recorded was not optimal, but we can make it all smooth in post-processing, or what I call mixing. And it's what your podcast needs, because this first track, if someone was listening in their car with, the sounds from the road doing highway speeds, probably all they would have heard was the portion where I yelled too loud. But since this was compressed and the quiet parts were brought up, the loud parts were brought down, and they meet in the middle, your listener can hear everything. And isn't that why we record these podcasts? To be heard. And a lot of people, they get the message down and they don't get the audio down. You're saying things to be heard, so make sure that you're heard. Make sure every part of you is heard. We wouldn't be making these podcasts if we didn't think we had something important to say. Say it. Say it loud. Say it proud. Say it consistently loud. It's important. Compression is super important. It is, I think, the most important over everything else in this medium. It needs to be consistent. You need to be heard. Make sure you're heard. Take your podcast, play with the threshold, change the ratio, and just play with these settings and just listen. Have a bunch of different tracks where you adjust things differently. Now, the one thing that I will say, and I'm ready for people to get upset with me, and I apologize up front, but Audacity, the very popular tool in podcasting, I don't look down upon it in a superiority way, but the thing that is difficult with it is if you want to mix the audio, you want to play with compression, you can't do it in real time. So I can take this track here. First of all, what I just did, you can't do in Audacity, expose more of the track behind it, but we can listen to these adjustments in real time. So let's listen to this. Apparently, Doug was also friends with Brandon Boyd from Incubus, so he's just got a little star-studded friend circle there. I don't know. I mean, some of that comes out in their, some similarities. So just running in the same circles, you end up making, similar music with your friends. So I thought that was super interesting. And just to give you the scale of how big The Reason was, it's definitely their most commercially successful single. All right, so I just adjusted every single parameter on this compressor as I was listening to the track. In Audacity, you have to take your track, you have to punch in your settings, it has to process, you have to wait, and then it physically changes the file on your disk. And if you don't like the way it sounds, you have to hit undo and then try it again without listening. The thing that's important with any other editor in the world other than Audacity is it's non-destructive, meaning I might cut this clip down to a couple seconds, 19 seconds, but the entire hour and some of audio is still there. It's still maintained. So I don't have to really undo anything. I can just kind of slide it all back into place. I apologize because I don't know what we're listening to at this moment. That kind of scares me, but I can find my threshold as I'm listening to the audio. I can see it in my mind. It may have been like an Arby's or possibly not a Subway. I don't know, but we were eating and God, I remember which way we were all facing and stuff. But then I heard the piano, the dun, 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 dun. And I remember being like, oh my God, I love this song. Okay, so I just dialed in this compressor in the matter of seconds as I listened to the track. It wasn't guesswork and processing and waiting and listening. No good, undo, re-guess, essentially. You can do it in real time, and it's important for anything in audio. If you're doing EQ, you're adjusting the frequencies. If you're playing with compression, if you're playing with noise reduction, it's good to hear these things in real time. Now, the purpose of this course is not to convince you away from Audacity, but it is much easier to learn how you're affecting audio when you can hear the effects as they're happening, as you're adjusting them. So if you really want to play with this, if you're on a Mac, check out GarageBand. There are free trials of Reaper. It is an unlimited free trial. The full license is $60, but you can just hit, let me stay on the trial forever, and you can play with these real-time tools. And a compressor is an important one because the settings depend on so many things, and they all need to be right. So I urge you to find an appropriate tool that will work with you, not against you, to learn proper audio. Now, one of the benefits I'm giving people who access this video through Podcaster's Kit, which is the only way that it's accessible, is I'm offering some limited consulting to go along with this video so I can help you through some of your compressor questions. If you email me, hello@cleancutaudio.com, it will come to my inbox and I don't know what the demand is going to be like, but I will try as best as I can to help everyone through email. If you require more from me and you need some coaching calls, you need me to sit down and really go over this stuff in one-on-one or maybe some group calls, I'm offering those at a severely discounted rate for anyone that purchased Podcaster's Kit as a further token of my appreciation. And especially since I'm telling you this so far into the video, it lets me know that you got this far. And if you want more, I'm willing to give it to you. I'm really excited about being able to help people out in their quest to master audio. I will be the first to tell you, you will never master audio. There are people that have dedicated millions of dollars in their entire life to this art form, and they will probably tell you, I'm so far from where I want to be. Think of the best of the best. It would be like Michael Jordan saying, I barely know how to dribble. That's kind of how audio is. The better you get at it, the further away perfection seems. It's a really interesting thing, but it makes audio fun because you can always get better and you can always want for more. And if you're that type of personality, that can be great. If you're the type of person that just wants to put out a podcast, you learn your compressor settings, and as long as you record your audio the same way every time, it should work pretty well. Like, for example, when I do my show, I don't adjust too many settings. I've done 150 episodes of it, so I know how my voice sounds, and it just gets easier once it's dialed in and it's locked in. You can always optimize, but if you're just doing your own show, you can kind of get this down and leave it. If you're producing shows for others, it'll be a little bit of adjusting every time, but you're going to be looking at threshold number one. How much do you want to cut down? The ratio, how much do you want to cut it down by? The attack time, how fast do you want to start cutting? And the release time, how fast or how slow do you want to end your cutting once cutting time is over? You get it? Again, if you have any questions, email me hello@cleancutaudio.com. I'll be so happy to help. And I'm really excited to see who all out there was interested in this course. If you want more from me, I have an active YouTube channel. It is youtube.cleancutaudio.com. You are on it right now because I sent everyone to a private YouTube link. You can only get it through this course. So check out the other stuff. I do a lot of tips, really short weekly ones that are just in and out. It'll help you with your workflow, maybe some editing tricks, how to mount foam panels. I did a recent one. And then I do maybe monthly deeper dives because they take absolutely forever to do. And those will be free. And if you have any questions, you can leave a comment on YouTube. You can email me. I'm more than open to suggestions on what videos to do next. But friends, thank you so much for sticking with me through this whole video. It was a super long one, I know, but there are so many parts to a compressor that all need to work together. And I want to give you the most value that I can out of this video because it's so important. So thank you so much. My name is Tom Kelly. My company is Clean Cut Audio, and I'm here to help you whenever you need it. Thank you so much. Bye.